the American League Championship. I don't believe it. It just continues. My, oh, my.
High fly ball into right field. She is gone.
Oh, drives one. Right field. Did he do it? He did. Are you kidding me? Let's go.
Welcome back to the FSS Plus podcast. Jason Churchill alongside Joe Doyle. And we've got tunnel vision right now. At least I do. Joe, we're about a week out from the 2023 MLB draft. Where has the time gone, first of all? But I'm curious what your sleep schedule is looking like these days. Like, how's that been going? How's
you
life?
Texted me at 4:00 in the morning yesterday. So generally it's a little better than today.
Yeah, I imagine that's going to get worse too. Just lots going on. I feel like what's funny here in this particular time, someone like you or someone like, I'm not as in the weeds with it as you are these days, but I've experienced it in the past. One of the things that happens a little bit more at this point is you hear that there's more activity from the area guys, like reaching out to you. I imagine this is similar to your experience, but less of everybody else. The checkers aren't as responsive and aren't as talkative when you get to them. The scouting directors aren't as responsive or as talkative because they're busy. They're in draft rooms. They're trying to figure this out.
Well, and their jobs are on the line.
Yeah, that squeezes your time too, and you're not sleeping, and you got to be on their schedule. And yeah, you want to talk to the Pirates scouting director? You got to get up at 4 a.m. on the West Coast.
Agents seem to have a wide open schedule this time of year.
It's amazing. It's almost
they're
like
very eager to tell you what they think.
They tell their families, "You don't have a birthday at draft time." I've had a guy tell me that. I'm telling you, and I don't want to. Not that millions of people are listening to this, but I don't want to blow out his name and this get out. But there is a very, very prominent player that plays in a very, very large market that got a very, very large contract whose agent literally told me that's what he does. Yeah, but Dad, my birthday is... No, it's not. No, it's not. Your birthday is at the end of the month.
Could you do me a favor and hold that baby for one more week? I got something this week.
Right. Everything's on hold. That's a good point, though. Agents, they'll find time to talk, man. It's pretty crazy. All right, here's what I'm going to do today. I want to dive into this Paul Skenes at 1-1 thing a little bit. Obviously, Paul Skenes, very, very good right-handed college arm. Ridiculous stuff. Has a chance to be one of the better arms coming out of the draft in a long time. It evokes names like certainly Garrett Cole out of UCLA in 2011, Steven Strasburg out of San Diego State down in 2009. That was one of the first drafts that I covered at ESPN, and it was like, well, Strasburg's going number 1. Let's figure out the rest of the draft. That's not necessarily the case this year because it's pretty strong, but this Paul Skenes 1-1 thing is interesting because of what it could do to the rest of the draft and the rest of the Pirates draft. So we'll dive into that a little bit. Also want to talk Kyle Teel. Joe, you were on Kyle Teel pretty early about the chances that he just skyrockets up boards. You were the first person I saw out there talking about Teel as a guy who he's probably already a first rounder here in February, but like this could continue to move, and it has. So I want to talk about the floor and the ceiling for him as a first round pick. And I wrote Thursday night that college hitters tend to move up. College players in general tend to move up late in the draft, at least the public boards. They move up the public boards. They were probably already up on team boards. But if there's an early run on college hitters, like a really early run, like instead of guys going 18 to 30, more of those guys, the Matt Shaws and Braden Taylors are going top 12, 14. What does that do to the rest of the draft? So we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Also, quick correction. It's Kyle Northwest Green to you. Don't forget it.
Good Lord. Oh, all right. So
I don't make the rules, man. Kevin makes the rules.
Kevin makes the rules. Yeah. So, geez, Teal. Yeah. It's not a good color, bro. Like, I'm just gonna say that and move on. The Northwest green, the action green, the whatever you want to call it, is not a good color for baseball uniform. But Kyle Teel, certainly one of those prospects that's a little bit polarizing in that way. So we'll dive into that in a little bit. Paul Skenes, Joe. I hear this. I hear a lot of hyperbole when I hear people saying, "Oh, he's the best pitching prospect to come out in decades." I think that's a little much. I do. I see special, potentially a special, arm there. Absolutely, 100%. Pitching with pitchers, the stuff is easier to project than it is a hitter. So it's easy to see a guy that fits at the front of the rotation. But a lot of things happen. When Garrett Cole came out, the word on him in 11 out of UCLA was obviously the big fastball, up to 99. But his best secondary pitch at that point was a really firm, change-up splitter type pitch. Not kidding. It wasn't his slider, it wasn't his curveball. And now he throws both of those pitches. More pitchers change is the whole point. And we just don't know how they're going to get to where we think they're going to get. So I'm a little hesitant on calling Skenes some sort of generational pitching prospect, but obviously he's very, very good and elite in a lot of ways. And the buzz lately, and again, you were the first that I saw reporting on, how this seems to be the way it's leaning right now, is that the Pirates are leaning to Skenes at number 1 instead of Dylan Cruz, which is fine. I completely understand it. I want to understand what they're going to do with it. What is the idea here, Joe? What kind of savings are we talking about for that particular spot in the draft? And what exactly is, could the Pittsburgh Pirates be thinking? Because they pick number 1, and I have the slot values in front of me. That slot at number 1 is $9.7 million in change. Okay. So what's the thinking here, that they can get Skenes for 9 or something along those lines and use it later? And if so, what are they going to use it on? I mean, that's the thing. If Cruz is going to cost slot and Skenes is not, I get it.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of precedent for this, right? For this either, right? I mean, you go back and you look at some of the last 5, 6, 7 years, not a lot of pitchers going at the top of any one draft. Casey Mize stands out, but I mean, that was kind of a down year in 2018. And, going back to that year, let's see, the Tigers only saved $600,000 by taking him first overall. So that was
about where the same percentage. Right.
That's where the pick value, but that's where the pick value was 8.1, and now we're up to 9.7. So I think that was a year where I think you could probably make a case that Casey Mize and Joey Bart were equally interesting at the very top of the draft. And I kind of look at it like that this year. So kind of going back to what you said, what kind of savings could you have here with the first pick? Well, there's kind of 3 players leveraging themselves against one another. I think Wyatt Langford is in this conversation, and I don't think people are probably giving that quite enough respect. I do think Wyatt Langford is in the conversation at 1. So if you're Skenes, you know that you're going 2, right? I mean, worst case scenario, if you're Paul Skenes, you're going number 2. So that means you're locked in to at least 8.9 million. You have the leverage to bid against 8.9 mil. So what does that generally mean for the savings that you could do? It's got to be above that. I mean, I would think that the Pirates, to land Paul Skenes, would probably have to pay him 9.2 to go first overall. And at that point, as you kind of alluded to, you're saving $500,000. What does that subsequently afford you later in the draft? And are those savings, is $500,000 worth passing up a Dylan Cruz?
Right. The Pirates pick, their next pick isn't until 42, I believe. They do not have a competitive balance round A selection. So their second round pick is at 42, and the slot there is a little over 2 million. And then they pick again at 67 and 73. So they do have a competitive balance round B selection. So is this something that, to me, I'm thinking about $500,000 and I'm like, I'm kind of shrugging my shoulders. I'm not saying it's nothing, but I'm shrugging my shoulders. I don't see a Carlos Correa, Lance McCullers Jr. kind of a combination here necessarily. Something that really sticks out to me. But again, teams do, I mean, you can speak on this more than I could, at least from recent years. Teams kind of cut deals with players beforehand. Like Pittsburgh might know exactly what they're doing at 1, as long as it doesn't fall apart, and exactly what they're doing at 42 or 67 or 73, or really all 4 of those potentially, including the dollars. And as long as it doesn't fall apart at the last second, they just go and execute on draft day.
I mean, I would think you're correct. They probably have an idea of the one specific player that they have in mind at 42, and my guess would be that player that expects to go at 42 knows that their priority one at 42.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of guys. I don't see a lot of guys in this draft unless Pittsburgh is pulling down someone truly exceptional, like a Colt Emerson or some of these guys that are projected to go in the 20 to 25 range, which at that point, the 20 to 25 range, those bonuses are 3.1 to 3.7. So
Mhm.
you're not going to make up that difference. It doesn't make sense for the player. Really, what you're able to do by having the 42nd pick and adding 500 or 600 grand to it is you're able to pull someone down effectively from pick number 33, essentially like 10 spots.
Mhm.
So in that position, you're looking at on our board at least, you're looking at Kevin McGonigal, Dylan Head, Charlie Soto, Adrian Santana. And my question to you would be, now granted, we don't know what these players are going to look like 8 years from now, but are any of those players, their frames, their tools, their tools, their skill sets, are any of them really worth the difference of taking Paul Skenes over Dylan Cruz? Because you got to remember, yes, it'll afford you the ability to get a Kevin McGonigal, but you can still get name your player that fits at 40 to 45,
Right. Like if you're telling me it's
like a Trent
Paul,
Caraway.
if you're telling me that it's Paul Skenes and say Kendall George at 1 and 42 versus Dylan Cruz and Liam Peterson, I'm not really seeing the difference. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We all know that. The
That's
Pirates
the
may just
thing.
think completely differently of some of these guys. But if that's the difference, as I look at your latest board, I don't see a difference. I really truly don't see a significant enough difference. I'm taking the best player. If I think Paul Skenes is the best player, I'm going to do this regardless. I'm going to do this whether I have some sort of special plan and an eye on a guy at 42 that I don't think I can otherwise get because I'm going to need to pay him an extra 400,000 to 600,000. I'm just taking Skenes because I think he's the best guy, and the fact that I'm getting him for 9.1 or 9.2 or whatever is a bonus to me. And we'll just
Yeah.
do with it what we can, and I'll worry about the margins, later. But if I think Wyatt Langford or Dylan Cruz is the best player, I have a hard time at that spot giving that up. I really do. So if I'm Pittsburgh, I'm taking whoever I think's the best player. Like even if I have to pay full slot, I'm taking the best player. Here's the thing with college guys. So Dylan Cruz, yes, these guys are juniors. So we think like technically, do they have leverage? Yes. But Joe, you and I both know, everybody out there knows, Dylan Cruz, wherever he gets selected, is signing with that team. Paul Skenes,
No
wherever
doubt.
he gets selected, is signing with that team. Wyatt Langford, wherever he gets selected, is signing with that team. 1, 2, 3, 4, it doesn't matter. They're signing with that team because the risk of going back, not having as good a year, because all three of those guys had monster seasons, not having as good a year, getting hurt, lots of things can happen. And as a senior, you have literally zero leverage. You can't go back to school. So there's no upside for those guys to hold out big time. I read a question on my show last week where it was like, well, what if you draft a guy and he's just like, yeah, I know I hinted that I'd take, 2 million, but now I want 3. Well, call his bluff. To be honest with you, if it's a college guy, call his bluff. That's what I would do.
Right.
It,
You
it
have to.
does happen on occasion. It happened to the Seattle Mariners in I believe it was round 3 when Kevin Cron came out and they had a pre-draft agreement that he would take like 800 grand, and then they they take him, and the family thought, well, now we have the Mariners where we want him. Now we can just demand 1.2 and get it. And the Mariners were like, well, we don't have it to give you, so we're not going to get. And then he ended up going to college and getting drafted far later, and he lost money out on the deal. So it does happen, but it's risky for the player too. I just don't. That's not going to happen in the top 5, top 10. I just
I'll do you one
can't see it.
better. I'll do you one better. The pick value at 1 is 9.7. The pick value at 2 is 8.9 to 9, right in that range.
Right.
You could select Dylan Cruz with the number 1 overall pick and offer him 9.4 and save yourself 300 grand. And I still don't know if Dylan Cruz has the ability to say no to that. Yes. No. Are you going to kick off your relationship with a potential cornerstone player on very rocky terms? Sure. Are you setting yourself up for a begrudging prospect to never sign a long-term deal with you. Sure, both of those possibilities exist. But if you really wanted to save those, few $100,000, Dylan Cruz is not going back to school and
Right.
hoping that he's the number one pick again.
Right. It's not happening with Langford. Most of the guys in the top 10, like they're not even going to think about that. The college guys, the high school guys is a little bit of a different story. It's a little bit of a different conversation. Some of these guys don't want anything to do with college,
Yeah.
but
You know
they're
how
not
you
letting
said,
that out because it's leverage. Some of these guys really do value the idea of going to Vanderbilt or UCLA or whatever it is.
yeah.
Very, very
You know how
interesting.
you said that Dylan Cruz has leverage because he's a junior?
I
I would
mean,
argue he doesn't have leverage because he's the number one pick.
yeah, I think technically he does because he's Dylan Cruz. But you're right. That's exactly my point, actually, Joe, is that like he's not going back to school. So if you're convinced that there's pretty much no chance he goes back to school unless you select him and super lowball him like ridiculously and you only offer him the minimum that you have to offer, then maybe you could, kind of tick him off and send him back to school that way, although there'd probably be a grievance filed at that point. But
Definitely.
yeah, he's not going back to school. So like how much leverage does he have? That's exactly what I'm saying, Joe. I completely agree. If I'm Pittsburgh and I'd like to get Dylan Cruz, but I want to save $300,000, I'm telling Dylan Cruz, we're taking you, and the number is 9.4. That's it.
I think that's what I would do. I don't know what their plans are for the rest of the draft, but if your
Mhm.
options are Paul Skenes at 9.1, and this is presuming that they have Dylan Cruz at the top of their board, mind you.
Right.
But if your
Right.
options are Paul Skenes at 9.1 or Dylan Cruz at 9.4, I think it's a fairly straightforward answer.
Yeah, for me it is, and I've made this known. I'm much more likely to take the bat at that point than the arm.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, I just like it's, and I understand Dylan Cruz, Wyatt Langford, not long-term center fielders. They're both pretty good athletes, but not guys that are just going to like run balls down for 10 years in center field at an above average level. They're corner guys, but they're impact hitters who probably move pretty quickly. And that's the inefficiency in Major League Baseball right now. Like guys like Dylan Cruz and Wyatt Langford, that's the inefficient. That's the thing we always talk about. Hey, it's really difficult to find catchers. So it's really difficult to find shortstops and second basemen that can hit and defend. True. It's also hard just to find really good hitters that aren't going to take 6 years to get to the big leagues.
Fact.
There's no reason to think Cruz and Langford aren't in the big leagues in 2-3 years, right? Like I would think 3 years maximum, right? Like barring some sort of weird, he stubs his toe 9 times and has to sit out. They're going to move quickly.
I would think end of 2025. Yeah.
Right. And I think
Summer
like you look at
2025.
Paul Skenes and I'm just not convinced that he's generational really. Like maybe there's another gear there and I'm not seeing it, but I haven't talked to anybody who thinks that.
I've gone back and forth on that, and I always land on, well, someone has to be generational. And having what, I mean, not necessarily from every draft, but there has to be a guy that ends up being generational. And
Mhm.
I feel like if it's not the guy that didn't walk anybody, throws 102, throws a 91-mile-an-hour slider, holds 101 through 110 pitches, is 6'6", like
Mhm.
if it's not that, and if you want to nitpick, like, yeah, he doesn't spin the ball great, yeah, the fastball is kind of dead zone, but I think it's made up for in deception. If it's
Sure.
not Paul Skenes, I think you just have to dig harder and look deeper to actually unearth that generational guy.
Yeah, but that's my whole thing with taking an arm at one. You just better be sure that he's really, really special, because you're asking for, you're
But
kind of asking for it.
a
To be
lot of the
honest,
special,
there's risk in taking the arm anyway because of the injury factor, right?
no doubt. But I would say a lot of the best pitchers in baseball, let's get rid of the last 2 years of Steven Strasburg, but
Mhm.
look at Steven Strasburg's peak. Look at Garrett Cole. Look at
Mhm.
Trevor Bauer is a very unlikable guy, but look at what Trevor Bauer was when he was in the league.
Mhm.
Look at Justin Verlander. I mean, the top, the horses were generally college. Aaron Nola. These were generally college arms taken at the top of a draft.
I will counter that, Joe. It's a
Okay.
good point, but I'll counter that. And this is why I feel the way I feel about Skenes. You better be sure he's generational because like this is the last 4 years in Major League Baseball. I'm just going to use wins above replacement as just a very general, kind of slide rule. Like you look at the most valuable pitcher since the start of the 2020 season in Major League Baseball is Zach Wheeler. He was a top 10 pick. Okay, Kevin Gossman, top 10. But you know who's number 3 on that list? Corbin Burns. Do you know where he was selected? Yeah, he was a
there's
4th
definitely
round
going
guy.
to be outliers.
But we can go
Yeah.
a lot further. Shane Bieber, not a first round pick. Like Logan Webb, Brandon Woodruff, Zach Gallen, like Dylan Cease. Like we can go down the list. That's the top 20. And of
Clayton
the guys that
Kershaw.
are drafted, more than a third of them were not even first round picks, let alone top 5 picks. I just think I look at it from, if I'm the Pirates or I'm the Nationals. If I'm the Nationals, it's a little bit different. But if I'm the Pirates and I have a choice between Cruz and Langford, like I'm not even sure Skenes is that heavily on my radar at this point, unless it's a negotiating ploy.
Yeah. I think there's 2 ways to look at this. I think both of these things. I think what you and I are both saying is true. Like there has never been a time in Major League Baseball where it has become more commonplace to develop really good arms. And I think we're seeing that at Bryce Miller, Emmett Sheehan, Matt Brash, like we're seeing good arms come up as 3rd or 4th rounders. But I also think you can look at it from the other side and just say, also the college pitchers taken in the top 3, 4, 5, like they end up
They
being
do well.
studs.
They absolutely do well.
I think it's
absolutely
both.
Man, it goes back forever. That's been a forever thing. Yeah, that's been and the guys that don't generally, I mean, we think of Mark Appel, who probably was never actually that good in the first place. And you think of a guy like
but John Gray was taken in that draft, number 3, and he has been let's say a good number 3, and at times an okay number 2.
Right.
So I mean that's an example of a horse.
And that's kind of the floor when you take a guy in the first 5 picks, right? That's kind of the floor as you're getting a mid rotation.
You would have to think so. I mean, Kevin Gossman was the first arm taken in 2012,
and it took him a while to get there. It took him a while to get there, but that's not because he didn't belong in that portion of the draft, right?
Now he's a Cy Young guy. So,
and then we think about Casey Mize. That's an injury situation. Like if he was 100% healthy,
that's bad luck.
Like
Holton, same thing.
What happens to that if he's not healthy? So Max Fried, a kid out of high school that was taken really high, has had a really good career. It's one of the top 15 pitches over the last 4 years. So so the risk on performance isn't there. It's not. It's injury and
it's expectation.
And how good is he really, and how valuable is it? I guess that's what I'm saying, is how valuable is having a 1 or a 2 versus having that 5-win player playing right field or third base. I'm not even talking about guys up the middle.
That's the quintessential question, because I think if you are betting on the medium outcome for both of these players, like how much more valuable is a 5-win outfielder than a 5-win pitcher? I think it's pretty cut and dry. Right. The outfielder provides more value on a day in and day out basis because the bat has it has an impact on the players around him too. Yes, right. The arm could single-handedly win you by himself 15 games a year. Just the other team didn't stand a chance. But the bat has a solid impact on your lineup, up and down the lineup, and changes
the game plan on your lineup every day.
It changes the complexion of your entire team in some cases.
And there's less of them. There's just less of them. If you went around and looked at, like, I don't know, like to put a wins above replacement, but to put a WAR number on a slot in the rotation is difficult. I haven't really thought about it much, but like if a number 1 starter is a 7-win starter and a number 2 starter is a 5-win starter and a number 3 starter is like a 3 to 3.5 wins, like if we did something along those lines, there are more arms that are going to be 3-win arms that fit into those 3 slots than there are outfielders.
Definitely.
It's crazy, even though there are 3 starting outfielders. Like,
let me throw another example at you, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. Now, I think you and I both are of the opinion that Dylan Cruz is pseudo generational. He's something of the sure thing conversation, right? Sure. If you go back to 2015, let me just read off the first 2 college bats taken in every draft. Now, 2015 was Dansby Swanson and Alex Bregman. They've been cornerstones for wherever they've been for the most part. It took some time for Dansby, but 2016 you got Nick Senzel, who's struggled, and Corey Ray, who hasn't hardly had a pro career. 2017 you got to go down to Pavin Smith, it's been rough, and Adam Hazley. Now Pavin Smith has actually had an okay last couple
Sure.
of years, but
It's a major leaguer at least.
speaks to those two. You go to 2018, Joey Bart, who has largely been a disappointment, and Alec Boehm, who has been a steady, not spectacular, everyday regular. And then I'll do the last one here, 2019, and we'll probably want to do 2020 for the sake of where the player has been. Adley Rutschman and Andrew Vaughn, both of them have been steady guys. 2020 was Spencer Torkelson and Heston Kjerstad. The jury's still out. So I guess my entire point in all this, it's a long-winded way of saying, while I think you and I would both agree that Dylan Cruz is only in the same conversation there as a Adley Rutschman.
Right.
He's a better prospect than what Dansby Swanson was, and he's just an entirely different prospect than what Alex Bregman was. I think it still speaks to the fact that there's no sure things in either case, and I think you just take whatever you think personally is the surest thing, because they're both premium prospects.
For you, Joe, as we close this out, are you at all? I'm big on like tiebreakers. Okay. Now, if you talk to guys that have been in that draft room, that are in that draft room, they will tell you there's really no such thing. They will tell you that there's really no such thing. Guys at the top, guys that are scouting directors, GM, there's no such thing. You will always find a way. If you're pitting Paul Skenes against Dylan Cruz, there aren't any tiebreakers where you go, well, and then pitchers are more likely to get hurt. So that bumps Skenes.
I hate that conversation.
They don't do that. Like, it's already kind of wrapped up in the evaluation of the players themselves. So there really aren't tiebreakers. You will find a way to give that extra little tiny bit of credit or points to one player or the other. And you will just never, even at number one, you will never actually be 100% even. But how much for you would organizational, these are two college players. We're talking about Dylan Cruz. We'll throw Langford in there too. Langford, Cruz, and Skenes. These are three college players that are likely getting to the big leagues pretty quickly. And Skenes, like, you could throw him into the majors right now and he could get outs. So at what level would you, if you're the general manager, if you're Ben Sherrington in Pittsburgh, do you say, let's take the guy that's going to get to the big leagues the quickest and help us in an area where we lack? Because that pitching in the Pirates organization, Priester's pretty close, but other than Mitch Keller, there's not a lot going on really close to the majors and in that major league rotation. And Skenes literally could be there next year.
It's a good question. I wouldn't put any onus on that because they need bats too. Like, you look at that farm system, it's not like they're like, oh, we got so many bats at the doorstep. I mean, they still need, and especially impact bats. Like, they don't have, Henry Davis could be an impact bat, but they don't have a lot of middle of the order guys, not knocking on the door. So I guess it kind of depends. Like, if I'm Artie Moreno, the answer is very easy. If I'm Ben Sherrington, it's a very different question.
Here's what's very telling about what you just said, Joe. You mentioned the general manager in Pittsburgh and the owner in Anaheim.
Well, we know who the puppet master is going on there.
Absolutely. Yep.
And if it's not the puppet master in LA, it's, hey, we're going to give you this shot, Perry, but also you have like 2 or 3 years to get this done, because if Shohei doesn't stay, we're going to pivot.
Yeah.
We
should probably have a conversation after the draft about Shohei Ohtani and what happens there too.
Yeah, probably. They won't trade him though. The worst thing that ever happened for the Angels is they're competing.
No, but yeah, absolutely. But what do you do? Like, what do you do if you're Anaheim at the end of the year and he walks? That puts him in a tough spot. They're kind of going for
him this winter.
They should have traded him for this. I'm really big on that. I think I'm calling it the Francisco Lindor rule. The Cleveland waited too long to trade Lindor. It hurt his value in more ways than one. And I feel the same way about just about every player where the team's like, well, we're not going to re-sign him because we're not going to give him the money it's going to take. So what are you doing? Like, why are you holding on to him? Anyway,
everyone has lost that trade. Everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The Mets gave Lindor a bunch of money, and while he's been good, he hasn't been great. So certainly not living up to that deal. One of my favorite players in baseball, Francisco.
Mine too. Lindor. I wish he was better, because I wish he was the face of baseball, to be totally, frankly, honest with you.
That's a good point. Me too. He's got style. He's athletic. He's fun.
Well liked.
Yeah, well liked. Does a lot of things on the field. I do wish he was more consistent at the plate. Hit 300, Francisco. Like, I'm not a big batting average guy, but hit 300 a couple of times. Yeah. That's all we need. All right. As we look at the way the first round might unfold, One of the names that's really climbed up boards really fast, and I think he's probably been in the top 10 somewhere for most, if not, maybe not the entire spring, but most of the spring, and that's Kyle Teel. And Joe, in your latest draft board, you have Teel ranked number 6, and I believe in your latest mock, you have him going, I believe, 6 to Oakland. I'm curious as to how high you think he might be able to climb here. So if we were to assume that Skenes and Cruz in some order go 1-2, because that seems like the consensus. I don't want to assume anything at 3, but it could be Langford, could be Jenkins, could be Clark. Like, what's the ceiling here for Kyle Teel out of Virginia? We'll dive into what exactly Kyle Teel is in a second here, but you have him going 6. Minnesota, unless Skenes were to fall, it looks like Minnesota is a really good landing spot for Teel too. Is 5 the ceiling, or could we see Texas or Detroit jump in on Kyle Teel for under slot, and we could see the Virginia catcher go even higher than he's projected at this point?
I've tried to figure out like different combinations of 1 through 3 and for what's on the board at 4. And I can't really find a situation where I think I would be comfortable saying Texas would walk away from Skenes, Langford, Cruz, and they've been so attached to Walker Jenkins this whole time. He feels like he's going to be the pick. But that being said, if you look at what the Rangers did last year with Kumar Rocker, I mean, I think there stands a chance that they try and take a Kyle Teel, save. Here's the issue. You're not going to save very much money by taking Kyle Teel at 4. Like, this isn't like Kumar Rocker. If you take Kyle Teel at 4, the slot value is $7.7 million.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's making it past the A's, or maybe he could fall a little bit further than that, but he probably negotiates against the 5th or 6th pick. So, maybe you save $600,000 by taking Kyle Teel at 4. And in that case, I think they just take Walker Jenkins. So I tend to think the ceiling is 5 to Minnesota. I think there's an extremely light chance that he could go 4 to the Rangers. But man, it seems like it's a pretty tight bracket. Like it seems difficult to see him slipping past the Royals at 8. Like, that's kind of his range.
Somewhere between 5 and 8. Well, I can tell you this.
Picks.
I know the Marlins are angry with Rob Manfred because the Marlins would really like to have Kyle Teel and are willing to spend the necessary money and go over slot to get him. And they don't feel he's getting to them either. So, and the Marlins are at 10, and they're mad at Manfred because you can't trade picks. That's been the thing. Why can't we trade picks yet is what I was told like a month ago or so. Like, that would be great because moving from 10 to like 5 to get Kyle Teel is probably what the Marlins would consider.
This is kind of a fun little tease. I'm not going to give this to the podcast, but I'll tell you something that I heard after the podcast. Be kind of cool.
Ooh,
it adds on to your Marlins conversation.
A tease. Interesting.
Sorry, general public.
It's more like a na. Yeah, you'll find out sooner or later.
On July 9th.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're only a week away. We're a little more than a week away, so you don't have to sit around and wait. By the way, in general, are you for trading picks? Yeah, I imagine you are.
Definitely. I like what you've said in the past in terms of regulating the process of only being able to trade your first rounder every other year, or handling it some way that way. But yeah, I mean, it makes the event and it makes the sport inherently more interesting. Now, if it turns into the NBA draft where the same player is traded 5 times on the night they're picked, what's the point?
Yeah, so if you put those regulations on it, like for example, you can't, like you said, you can't trade your first round pick 2 years in a row. Like, maybe they only allow a team to here's the thing: you can't trade out of the first round 2 years in a row. Like, if you go from 6 to 12, and then the next year you go from 11 to 18, fine. Like, you haven't traded out of the first round at all, right? Because you're just maneuvering around and you're trying to make things, like that's probably fine.
Hey,
I also
really
think
quickly, kind of on the same note, not really on the same note at all. Now that I think about it. Do you realize that the Nationals, as poor as their season is going, cannot they can't have a top 6 pick next year?
Yeah.
So they should try and win.
Yeah. And you know what? Paul Skenes and Dylan Cruz can help them do that. Just getting them into their system, they can help them do it. Because when you feel like you have guys that are on the brink that are going to be on your major league roster within a couple of years, it's easier to start building that roster out. Like start doing it this winter, and you don't have to go through this big, long, giant rebuild. That the Juan Soto trade helped them. You get Mackenzie Gore and Abrams and Wood on the way, and like that was a big help to them. But yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, they should start trying to win. I think the Nationals doing something like what the Texas Rangers have done, going out and getting Semien and Corey Seager in a big offseason, even though they probably knew year one wasn't going to go great. I could see the Nationals doing that. I think what's holding that up, though, is the ownership change in Washington. So
I think
not
there's
sure
a lot of that right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that going in Baltimore, and it's everywhere.
Baltimore, what a terrible situation that is. They got a ton of young talent, and the owner's like, whatever. Like, whatever. Just put it all on the GM. It's awful.
Not good.
But by the way, if the Padres owner was in Baltimore probably would look like a World Series team right now because of what they already had coming up through the farm, and then going out and adding Bogarts and like what they've done the last couple of years in terms of adding their payroll. It's been absolutely crazy. So Kyle Teel really talking, that's a tight window, 5 to kind of 8 about right in there. That's the Twins to the Royals. Is there, like, we look at Cincinnati, by the way, at 7. And I think in your latest mock, and I'm sure you'll have an update here pretty quickly, but you have Rhett Lauder, the Wake Forest kid, going 7 to the Reds. If Kyle Teel is available at 7, do the Reds take him? They got a guy. They got a guy, but that's not really how the draft works. It's like, well, we don't need a catcher. First of all, you always need catchers. Second of all, it's BPA, right? BPA. And they do. Like, Kyle Teel's not going to be in the big, I mean, I don't want to guarantee. I don't want to tell Kyle Teel, you could be in the big leagues next year, bro. Joe, Kyle Teel's not going to be in the big leagues next year.
No.
I never want to tell a player he can't do something.
These guys haven't called a game.
Right.
They haven't, like, there's like 2 schools that actually let their pitchers call games. You got to learn how to handle a staff and quite literally how to call a game. So, no, he's not going to be in the big leagues until at least 2026.
Yeah, he's a 3+ year guy. Yeah, absolutely. He might hit his way there. Maybe they move him off catcher, but that's probably not a guy you take at 7 anyway. So if you're the Reds, are you pretty much looking at college guys there? And like, so Teel is 5 or 6 and then maybe 8 or 9. And if 8's the floor, we're just talking about a 3-team window: Twins, A's, Royals.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty tight window.
Yeah. That's pretty crazy considering, before the year started, most people didn't know who Kyle Teel was.
Yeah.
That's quite the lead. Good for Kyle Teel. He had a big year. All right, really quick before we get off of Teel, tell me what kind of comp Kyle Teel the hitter. Ignore the defense. Comp Kyle Teel the hitter. We're talking about a left-handed bat. He's not the 6'5", 220-pound Matt Wieters kind of a catcher. Tell us about Kyle Teel. Who does he remind you of? What kind of power numbers he's going to put up? What are his best tools? Give us a little mini scouting report if you could.
Honestly, he reminds me of 2 players. The swing reminds me a lot of Kyle Seager, actually. Yeah. There's a ton of loft. There's a ton of pull side emphasis. There is quite a bit of chase, but he really fights off the junk. I mean, it's weird. He's got a really high chase rate, but I think he ranks inside of like the top 10 in college baseball in actual out of zone contact percentage. So, a super aggressive hitter. All the emphasis is to the pull side, plenty of bat speed. He reminds me of Kyle Seager. He reminds me a little bit of, like, in terms of production, like Brandon Lowe. I think he's probably going to be a guy that hits like 245 with some strikeout issues and runs into like 22 to 25 home runs a year, which, for the number of 6 pick in the draft, you're telling me I'm buying, or I should be excited about a 255 hitter who only hits 24 home runs a year and strikes out a bunch. And I would tell you to go find me 3 other catchers. Also, Kyle Teel is probably going to steal you like 12 to 20 bases a year. Find me 3 other catchers that are capable of that sort of production behind the plate.
Yeah,
it's JT Realmuto and...
Yeah, there's a little Jason Kendall in there, except more power. which is kind of the modern day Jason Kendall, even though Teal's a left-handed bat. But when you look at the league averages, Joe, like around the league, like it doesn't sound good to say he might hit 245 or 250. But when you look around, like even with the shift restrictions and some of the new rules, the league is hitting 248. So if you're getting league average numbers from a catcher who also might steal you 15 to 20 bases a year, that's 248, 320, 410. That's the slash. That's the league average right now. If you get that from your catcher, you're doing really, really well. And if Kyle Teel is better than that, because he adds you some defense and he adds you some speed on the bases, at least early in his career. Like that's obviously a really, really good player.
I think if Kyle Teel is an above average defender, like I pointed out, or like we've pointed out in the past, and let's say he is a 245, 250 hitter, 22 to 24 home runs, 15 stolen bags in the first few years of his career. Like I think we're talking about a 4 to 4.5 win catcher.
Yeah, makes all-star teams.
Makes an all-star team every year. I mean, like those guys they don't exist.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a pretty decent crop of catchers in Major League Baseball right now, but it's very, very top heavy. It's the Adley Rutschmans and the Will Smiths and the Jonah Heims and JT Realmuto and the two Contreras guys, depending on if the one in St. Louis is actually catching. It's Cal Raleigh. There's some guy, Tyler Stevenson in Cincinnati, Shea Langoliers in Oakland. I really like their future. Keibert Ruiz and one, but it's pretty top heavy. They're like 10, 11, 12 guys that you're like, okay, those look like number one catchers. Absolutely awesome. But then you realize there are 30 teams in the league.
Yeah.
So a guy like Kyle Teel has tons of value there. Cool. It'd be interesting to see where he goes, but it certainly looks like somewhere in the top 10. And from what you just said, 8 is the floor. That's awesome. Kansas City could be replacing Salvador Perez with Kyle Teel, who they couldn't be more different athletically. But there's some similarities.
One's a tank and one's a deer.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Good stuff. Really quick before we go, college bats, college hitters, college players in general tend to move slowly the final month or so to the draft up boards, like at least public boards. We hear, hey, we really like Blake Mitchell. We really like Noble Meyer. We think he's a top 10 guy. We think he's a top 20 guy. And then all of a sudden that team comes up and both those guys are on the board and they take a college guy. This happens all the time, constantly. I've been hearing a lot of Matt Shaw, Teel, obviously, Tommy Troy, guys like that being talked about in the top 15 or so. Enrique Bradfield. And there's a chance that all of them go top 15. We get down to the Chase Davises and Braden Taylor. There are teams that think Braden Taylor's a top 10 guy. And if those guys do go, Shaw, Troy, Bradfield, Taylor, what does that do to the rest of it? Let's say those guys all go top 15. What does that do to the rest of the first round and the rest of day one, at least? Does that put the prep kids, the McGonagalls, the Colin Houcks, guys like that kind of, on notice as far as like, well, here comes the run on prep middle infielders? Or does this move the college pitching up a little bit in the draft? Because there are teams out there with models that extreme value the college player over the prep player.
I think one of the really interesting things is I think there's enough college bats that most people expect to go in the 15 to 25 range that if they do sneak their way, Bradfield is a great example. Blake Mitchell, I know he's a high schooler, but I think if you hear some of these surprise names in the 5 through 10, 11 range, everyone should probably be on notice that there's going to be some overslot fun that's going to take place like 30 to 40 because in a year that has this many college bats, there's usually some deals to be had, in the 6 through 15 range, right in there. And if those deals happen, it's going to push probably some, pre-draft deals down the radar into that 30 to 40 range. And so, let's say the first round ends and for some reason, Walker Martin is still available, or for some reason, Blake Mitchell is still available. Well, that player is probably available because there was a run on college bats and because there was a bunch of underslot deals. So I don't really know where the run would happen. I think there's some high school talent that is just too rich to be pulled down. Aiden Miller and
Sure.
Noble Meyer and Colt Emerson. Like, I don't think those players have a chance of being pulled down. But kind of the guys you mentioned, like the Kevin McGonagalls, Dylan Head, Sammy Stafura, George Lombard, like those guys could be packages with a college guy that goes a little bit earlier. That's actually something I'm really looking forward to. And I'll tell you, I do think Jacob Wilson is a name that falls into that bucket. Like, if Jacob Wilson is a guy that goes 8 or goes 10, I think there's been enough deflation in his value to where he could be a big package deal with a guy like, Blake Walters or, name your high school standout in that comp round A.
Interesting. Before we go, one thing. At this point, about a week out, we're about a week and a half out from day one of the draft, July 9. Is there a player that you tend to like for the first round that most don't? Do you tend to, like, I'm looking for Joe Doyle likes this guy better than pretty much everybody else?
In terms of just liking the player or thinking they're going to go in the first and nobody's talking about it?
I think you personally thinking this guy belongs like 25 to 40 when pretty much everything else you hear outside of your own brain and how you value his profile and his tools and things like that, everybody else has him like 70 to 100 or something like that. There's like, for me, there's always one or two guys like that. They're always, I look at a guy like this year, I look down at, I mentioned Kendall George. That's a guy to me that I would probably take in the top 30.
That's a great call.
Right. From the college side, like I see Mac Horvath and I'm thinking,
hell yeah.
Most teams have him in, I think the highest I've heard is like 47, but most teams have him in the 70s. And I'm thinking, if Seattle took him at 30, I'd be like, oh yeah, I see it. So there's obviously beauty in the eye of the beholder. I'm just curious who that guy might be for you this year. And it doesn't have to be first rounder that nobody sees as a first rounder. It could be like, you think this guy's a third rounder and everybody else thinks he's a seventh rounder.
And I'll do you one better. Like in the Seattle one, it probably doesn't happen, but I think there's a universe where Seattle does drag someone down to 22 and overslots them. Mm-hmm. And Mac Horvath makes a ton of sense at 30 to kind of clean up the financial situation there. But I got two guys. One, I think Bryce Matthews belongs in the first round. Mm-hmm. I don't know where. It's probably in the 25 to 35 range, definitely towards the end. But I think it's kind of hard to find a college shortstop with that much twitch and that much power. Like, they don't really grow on trees. And I know that there's some concerns over the entire hit tool, but like, man, that guy, if you put that guy right next to, give me a college third baseman.
Morales.
Maybe not Jake Gill. Yeah, Morales. I mean, he's not as physical as Morales, but he's a better athlete than Morales. Like, I'm all in on Bryce Matthews. I love that one. And I'll give you a deep cut. Mitch Jebb out of Michigan State I really love that player, and I think he's going to hit a ton. I don't care if he's in left field. I don't care if he's at second base. I don't care if he's at shortstop. That guy really interests me, and I would like to see Mitch Jebb go in comp round A because I think he's a really good player.
Yeah, he's a little bit of an unorthodox setup, right? Like, you can't, like, when you see video there's Mitch Jebb. Like,
he's Nori Aoki with like Subway footlong in him,
Right.
Yeah. Like, oh, he actually ate some food today.
Oh, that's good stuff. Joe, we'll talk again in about a week. We'll massage the next episode of this podcast around your schedule late next week as we lead into day one of the draft. Looking forward to your next draft board at futurestarseries.com. Looking forward to your final mock draft at futurestarseries.com. Follow Joe on Twitter at Joe Doyle, MILB. Yeah, you can follow me at Prospect Insider if you want. I'm not really big.
Follow Jason.
Yeah, I'm not going to give you a whole lot. Joe's going to give you good stuff, including through the draft. But you're going to want to be around at futurestarseries.com and around the socials all 3 days of the draft. We have big plans, and Joe is a big part of that. Joe, we'll talk next week. Try to get some sleep this week, huh? I know that's a difficult task this time of year.
Hey, man, It's your fault.
It kind of is, actually. Just a little bit. It's mostly
Not really. I slept right through it.
It's a little bit.
Back at 9.
All right. We'll talk next week. This has been the FSS Plus podcast.
So just chill till the next episode.